Hey fam, today we'll focus on game week 15, and as planned, we're slowly introducing other tools with the hope that it helps us grow in getting better at Sorare MLB, fantasy baseball in general, and maybe even grow to appreciate the nuances of baseball even more. And as usual, if you haven't watched the first, I think the title is lineup overview of this in the playlist, it might be helpful to know why I use certain data points and the thought processes behind it. And also, as usual, all that I share are available on the general Sorare MLB doc, with a few exceptions. That is on the Sorare FP doc, but eventually some of them will make it over, just like this game week 16 pitcher matchup details. All right, let's get to it. Going back to game week 15, looking at the general overview, and remember, these are the averages of the totals of the matchup, which I don't like averages, let alone averages of average, but it does allow us to quickly gauge who we might want to look further into. So, because it's currently highlighted, Toronto might actually do pretty well, specifically the left-hand bats of Belton and Varsho. But even better would be the Chicago White Sox, where Greinke is actually rating a little bit high, but he can be had. So I wish I had more White Sox because it's such a good weekend matchup where there are three weak pitchers facing a lineup that has the pieces to make the lineup longer. And what I mean by that is if we go to Fangraphs and their roster resources and go to the team, we can get a gauge of the lineup order or the usual lineup order, including how they bat, left or right-handed. And what I meant was Benintendi, Moncada, and even Sheets are left-handed bats that could specifically take advantage of these pitchers. And because of that, even the lower-tiered potential overperformers like Benintendi and Yohan Moncada and the high-risk, high-reward of Gavin Sheets might actually pay off. One of the things that can get lost when sorting aggregate numbers like this is the fact that this is a pretty interesting game week in that there are many matchups that have two left-handed pitchers. So depending on the correct stacks, including some right-hand bat platoon specialists, for example, Minnesota or San Francisco, these batters should have some form of added advantage. So sifting through, we see Houston, Minnesota, Washington, Colorado, Dodgers, San Diego, Giants, as mentioned. And then a key thing 2 game weeks out for game week 16, Seattle is facing three weak left handed pitchers in a game week. So J Rod, France, and even their platoon right hand bat specialist, AJ Pollock, might actually do something. But going back to game week 15, in order from best to not as great in terms of the two left-handed pitchers, it would be Washington, then Houston, Minnesota, Colorado, San Francisco, LA Dodgers, and San Diego. And I actually did a pre-draft right after the game week closed earlier, and it's something I'm trying to do to combat how I've missed game week deadlines. And after seeing that little nugget, I did a bunch more rearranging, and I think it might actually change a little bit more because I just saw something. But for now, let's go back to this sheet. This sheet is the probables with the pitching rating overlaid on top of it for each game week. Again, in order from best to not so great is Washington, Houston, Minnesota, Colorado, San Francisco, Dodgers, and the Padres. Washington has been such a thorn for me because the numbers and matchup grids continue to scream to start them, but I scream back and say, heck no, and then my Sorare data app scream afterwards, why didn't you do it? And to continue the stupidity, I actually didn't start any of mine this game week again, and they'll probably outscore a lot of my starters. Although, I thought I saw a call. Okay, I am starting one of them. So maybe I'm not as allergic to winning as I thought I was. All right, I'm finally growing and learning. And then next is Houston. And as mentioned in and like game week 14, maybe it'll help Abreu with the slump in general and specifically against left-handed pitchers who have up to this point owned him, which is not his historical norm. And we've already seen Bregman start to get back to the normal great to elite levels, and this will probably be another week that I'll feel the pain of not getting Dubon and San Francisco Giants Estrada cards, even though the value were very obvious a long time ago. And in terms of Minnesota, I'm not sure if Taylor and Solano can take advantage, but I am pretty sure that Buxton and Polanco could, and Correa could definitely use that help. In Colorado, on paper, this should help Bryant's averages of literally almost zero, or even Profar, but eh, that's far from likely in my opinion. And looking at the park factor, it just might not happen in this park, and not with the potential good side of Heaney and Perez coming out for that day. And going back to the pitching grid, Estrada might remain hot for San Francisco and hopefully helps Haniger sink and finally get rolling. Let's fix that real quick. So those are the two main batters that I think could take advantage. And in part because, so looking at their rating, Alcantara and Luzardo, they're pretty good. Now, granted, Sandy hasn't been Sandy this year, and Luzardo kind of falls apart after five or maybe six, but he's dominant prior to that. And then going back to Fangraphs roster resource, maybe if you have Flores, you can feel a little bit more comfortable, or JD Davis. And then back to this Dodgers matchup where I'm bracing myself for another Dodgers to look like the Super Dodgers this weekend. With a side note of, I think that there is a chance that the new coaching staff for the Cardinals and the new pitching coach in general is starting to take a turn, and some things might finally work. And poor Wilson Contreras graciously took the blame and as a scapegoat. And I'm mentioning all of that because this looks like St. Louis is actually good in pitching, and the box score would not say that. But maybe they finally will start to act like what the pitcher ratings have rated them to be, even before the recently good outings. And for the record, they were rated very low before that, and I didn't believe it, and I should have. But I'm a Cardinals fan, so what am I going to do? And speaking of Contreras, Wilson Contreras, the Cardinals will need to get his bat as a catcher and get a real batting order solidified, because their upcoming schedule, in terms of scheduled opposing teams' starting pitcher staffs, their xFIP is pretty tough. So unless there are many injuries when they play the current schedule, it won't be as easy as the past week. And for San Diego, I wish I could confidently say things like my extremely bullish statements about Cardinals the last two game weeks, but the two left-handed pitchers here can actually be tough at the moment. And more importantly, going to Baseball Savant's percentile and expected rankings, I'm just not sure why the team in general is just producing the way that they have been, and they haven't been producing like what they're supposed to, or at least capable of. And then going to the expected stats, it's not like their stars or their common bats, common in the lineup, I mean, are underperforming either. But going to the strength of schedule again, strength of schedule should at least help, and this game week should help to that end. So I'm thinking that all of this blue, meaning bad in Baseball Savant, will start to turn redder soon. Unless Paxton again looks like his no-hitter self from years ago, and Sale continues to avenge his bad start, because he was apparently really embarrassed, and good for him, he backed his words. So in contrast with what we went over with St. Louis earlier, St. Louis might be a sell high candidate if you're not too confident in their batters, whereas San Diego not only has great matchups upcoming, but said great matchups should persist throughout the season, or at least the core of the season minus the last month. Speaking of maybe looking at players to target, these teams down here might not, or their players might not do as well from a SorareMLB perspective, but Tampa Bay, Minnesota, Milwaukee, and a little bit of Philly, especially once they start to heat up, might end up being valuable to some of us. So going back to our pitching, I think that's some of the bigger targets in terms of targeting left-hand pitchers. For the left-hand bats, as already mentioned, Varsho and Belt will hopefully redo what they did when they were actually out of my lineups, and take advantage of some specific weaker pitchers or pitches of these three. So if we go to the pitching models data, the probable pitchers for that week, there are some pitches that can be detrimental to the pitcher, but good for the batters. And these two have pitched enough so we can tell that these are consistently bad. Or not bad, but they are bad enough to be taken advantage of. But, side note, unless you're Miguel, Clamp, Robbie, or Orange Fly, who immediately come to mind, and who know why these pitches can be taken advantage of, it's usually a good idea to stay away from these and instead focus on the pitching plus or stuff plus or pitching bots equivalent called bot overall. And then go off of those because most of us don't compete in the higher divisions where cards are limited and these things could actually matter. Or they always matter, but they matter even more. And actually, another tool or data point that might be helpful is Baseball Savant's park factors and filter it down to, in this case, we're looking at left hand bats, because this will give us a gauge of how a park can play for certain hitters. So in this case, it's Toronto left handed bats playing in Camden Yards, two of which could be power hitters. So I'd look at the extra bases and specifically the home runs because that's what wins game weeks. Or going back to our matchups grid, let's say you're a more contact centric team like Cleveland. We see that the park factor is bad, but is it bad for left-handers? And going back to Savant, look at that, it is. In Cleveland being contact centric, then we could focus on this WOBA con, which is weighted on base average, and then that con is the WOBA when the balls are put into play after contact. And in this case, City Field might not be as conducive to those types of hits or hitters. And then going back to our matchups page, scrolling through, Texas is facing Colorado. That's all we need to know. And Seattle, and actually St. Louis, has two very advantageous matchups regardless of the brand name of these pitchers. So, see Kellenic Rise might be a hashtag used this game week, hopefully. And for what it's worth, I don't see them benching him for a weak left handed pitcher. And actually, speaking of rising, going back to St. Louis, Gorman was finally given a chance to face a lefty because, he's one of the Cardinals' best hitters. So, of course, this is my Cardinals fandom talking here. So they said, hey, let's make it so that our lineups and team makes it so that it's made so that our power hitters don't get in. And by the way, St. Louis is a mess in terms of rotation. So if you're not into guessing, it might be wise to stay away from the non-core bats of Goldie, Arenado, Contreras, and Nootbaar. And from a SorareMLB point of view, unless Cardinals are able to trade pieces like O'Neill or Paul DeYoung, who's recently had a good run at things, it might not be the most fun ride this season. By the way, Paul DeYoung has done this spurt before. He did it last year even, and he changed his stance, etc. But just be aware that this has happened before, and hopefully when teams adjust their pitching towards him, he can make those subsequent adjustments. And if he does, then that's when I'd be feeling a little bit more comfortable. All right, enough talk about the Cardinals, and we can look 2 game weeks out onto game week 16. Now, I won't spend too much time because things could change, including the schedule or number of games, and more importantly, I'd want to spend more time to analyze things well. And the more pressing game week is game week 15, and this thing needs to be published. Not like when it was published so late the last time. So, as the overall, and then looking at the individual matchups, Miami, Detroit, Chicago White Sox, and San Francisco stand out, along the aforementioned Seattle for the 4 game week teams. So again, those teams have 4 game weeks and they have good matchups. Miami, Detroit, White Sox, San Francisco. The ones that have a 4 game week, but it's a little bit tougher of a schedule, would be Toronto, Tampa Bay, Philly, Colorado, St. Louis, Milwaukee, Atlanta, Miami. They don't have an easy of a schedule, but it is a 4 game week and it is baseball, so who knows? And in terms of the best matchups, in terms of the opposing pitcher's stuff and location plus ratings, but only have 3 games, they'd be Chicago, Minnesota, Cleveland, and Texas. So basically, this game week will be one of those weeks where anything can happen because of the many 4 game weeks, but some of them are very tough, versus very good matchups, but only 3 games. So I'd rather spend a little bit more time digging deeper and then doing another video on that because game theory will definitely come into play. But quick notes, things that immediately stand out. Chicago's Ian Happ and Bellinger might continue to heat up, and for the Cubbies' sake, hopefully Mervis can do something. For Minnesota, we can insert the same prior comments for Buxton and Correa, even though it's 2 of 3 right-handed pitchers. And this might be a Joey Gallo week because they might let him start against Manea, who unfortunately he just haven't been great for him. Also, same prior comments can be applied to the White Sox players, except add to it an even longer lineup because their right-hand bats can absolutely take advantage of Alex Hooper's beloved Cleveland Guardians, who he, being very data objective, would agree. And even if they don't, these 2 specific matchups of Logan Allen and Faedo, it might be enough to propel someone to a reward. And real quickly regarding Houston right-hand bats, I kind of found it funny that these are some of my recent transactions. And I haven't been playing or even setting up lineups for the common, not because I don't like it. As a matter of fact, it was one of my favorite aspects before all of the changes. But yeah, look how smart I am. Or how much I believe in the matchups, I guess. And by the way, the only reason that I got Abreu, a paid version of him anyway, is because if we were to go to the value section of the data set, this is my own little version, but I think on the shared drive it's called projected points divided by ETH or something to that effect. And then on my version, I just use percentiles. Well, the other day I saw something on the market and I quickly plugged in that ETH value, and then it spits out a number, and this number represents value relative to the others in this tier. And by tier, I mean I have value over replacement calculations, and then I convert it into percentiles. And yesterday's snap buy decision came from me sorting this by value over replacement player in terms of total projected SorareMLB points. Then, like I said, I plugged in the ETH and then it gives me a value. And by sorting it, this gives me a quote unquote tier. And I have other rows here, and the ones currently showing is the middle infielder one, which basically shows the value relative to all of the other middle infielders. And middle infielder I always have in mind because it's the most important position, or used to be anyway. So looking at the value of the rare, it alongside Salvi Perez has the most value for that price that I bought it at. And then going back to one of our sheets, the strength of schedule based on the opposing team's xFIP, Houston's strength of schedule for the batters rates very high, not only for the short term, but also for the long term. So being lucky in terms of reaching the cap 40 to 40 threshold, got to use that winning to buy a Brave. And by the way, seeing my relegation bound goalkeeper hit 100 on the one off week I don't start him was like the cherry on top, with highly recommending Arenado and not getting to pull the trigger. And then seeing him go off, but it's okay. One of my home teams won, and that's what matters, right? Right? Mm. But going back to this, one of the things to take note of is I actually did not sort this very well in that I sorted it by the total projected points. Because again, I have a long term view for my Houston player, even players as old as Abreu. Sorting it in this way is not my preference anyway. Now, it's probably a good idea when valuing based off of a purchase because at minimum, at least the projected points has a good floor. But in Sorare, this is what matters, specifically for the pitchers. It's the points per game. So it basically takes the total projected points and divides it out by the projected games that players projected to play. And another aspect that made me feel a little bit better in terms of snap buying a player is because his actual versus expected WOBA and his current actual versus his prior 5 seasons BABIP. So this is the balls in play. as we can see, he's been underperforming. Now, if this looked more like Santander or maybe even Rizzo, I would have been a little bit more hesitant because that means that the ball's in play for those two players anyway. They've gotten pretty lucky. And at some point, that BABIP, or that effectively batting average when the balls are in play, will come back down and regress down to its normal career average. And as a final note, my algorithm of rating a player specifically for Sorare MLB is low for Abreu. So even though all of these positive notes were here, I absolutely did not pay the current market average, just in case, because this number has been extremely good in terms of predictive value. So that's a little bit more under the hood than normal, but these are things that we will slowly dive deeper into as soon as more people are comfortable with some of the basics like these data sets or in terms of pitching these kinds of metrics. And going to the dashboards, this is exactly why I created the dashboards and why it's presented in this way. It's for people who are newer to MLB in general or baseball in general. I wanted them to get a really, really good tool to get a really good sense of what a player, quote unquote, looks like in terms of the big categories, right? Overall offense, plate discipline, it's their expected metrics or their projected metrics and where they land in terms of percentiles. Because looking at the upper right, intuitively, we know that, well, if you're 95%, i.e., greater than the 95th percentile, you're good. And then this section is made so that we can compare players. So as soon as our Sorare MLB community in general is more used to these kinds of things, then we'll dive deeper in under the hood. And by the way, this is Google Doc based, so you might want to get the app if you use this, so that going over here, you can just type in the name and same thing for the mobile app. And ooh, that is ugly, huh? So this is actually interesting, right? Because Arenado's no secret, and I'm pretty sure that the Baseball Savant page will look something similar. It's no secret that he has significantly underperformed, but if we look at his projected points, it's actually not so bad. And one of the things I like to look at is the weighted offense, or weighted meaning that it's the prior 5 seasons. Because typically, unless it's a injury riddled player or they're really old, things regress back to this. And at minimum, usually this player will get playing time. All right, so that's enough of a rabbit trail for now, but there are a bunch of different views if you needed it or wanted it. So I'll end it there, and I hope all this helps, and I hope your name is high up on the leaderboards for both of these game weeks. Thanks, fam.